evolution. And we will talk about the basic definition of evolution, but most of this chapter is going to focus on some of the mechanisms that help drive the evolutionary process. All right, so what is evolution? I'm going to link to this video so you can watch it on your own, but it gives a very nice basic description of evolution, and it defines it as any change in the heritable traits within a population across generations. So this is really a very simple idea, um, and you can see this happening. Any two organisms that reproduce sexually, their offspring are going to vary from generation to generation just due to diversity that's occurring because of sexual reproduction. And you throw random mutation into the mix on top of that, and the bottom line is you are going to get genetic differences from generation to generation within any population. And that is the basis of evolution. That is the simplest definition of evolution. So it's kind of unfortunate that evolution has come to be considered, you know, something of a controversial theory, because, as I just said, it is very simple and very basic, and there's nothing really controversial about it. Um, I think part of the confusion kind of comes about from the term the theory of evolution. And I just wanted to point out that the word theory is used very differently in the sciences than it would be in just everyday speech. So if you hear theory just being thrown out in normal speech, that really typically means some kind of untested hypothesis or a guess. Whereas in science, theory is referring to this large, comprehensive body of work that you're trying to tie together um, into something much more unified and detailed, so that you could use this theory to help solve problems and apply it to real world situations. So really, if we want to talk about evolutionary theory, we would define that as the understanding of evolution and the application of the mechanisms of evolution to biological problems. That could include, biomedical type problems as well as environmental issues. And I've got another video here I'll encourage you to watch, and I'll link to it on Canvas. Um, just showing some of the practical ways that evolutionary theory is being used to solve real world problems. Now, we can't talk about evolution and evolutionary theory without talking about Charles Darwin. Um, so Darwin, as a young man, was somebody who was very interested in the sciences. He was very well read in terms of the geology of his day. He was alive in um, the mid 1800s, and he was also very interested in what we would have called the natural sciences. He would have considered himself a naturalist. He was very interested in collecting insects, for example. Originally, he went to Cambridge to become a physician. His father was a doctor, but ended up switching to theology, which is somewhat ironic considering the conflict between uh, religion and evolution in some instances. But he really wanted to be a parish priest in England. Um, Especially in those days, those were very well educated individuals. A lot of them had background in the sciences, and he had a couple of role models who were also parish priests and scientists, and he really saw himself fitting nicely into that life, being able to pursue some of his scientific passions in the background behind his church work. So just as he was finishing up school and before he really got established in his own church, he was offered the position of sort of captain's companion slash naturalist on this around the world trip on the ship called the HMS Beagle. So this was in 1831. And it was too good an opportunity to pass up, get to go see the world. And you can see the voyage they took here, the path they took, truly was an around the world trip. And they made lots of stops on different continents, spent time ashore, so Darwin was able to collect lots of samples of plants and animals, observe living organisms in these very different environments in South America, famously in the Galapagos Islands off the coast of Ecuador, um, in Australia, New Zealand, and even in a little bit in southern Africa. So as Darwin took this trip, I think what really caught his attention was the fact that uh, there were many, many different environments, obviously, around the world, and many, many different organisms that he had not seen before. But what really caught his attention was the fact that no matter where he went, the organisms that he was seeing, plants and animals, seemed to be very well suited for these specific physical environments in which they lived. And so there seemed to be this almost sort of like perfect adaptation for the very specific conditions in these different parts of the world. And so this led him to propose this theory of a mechanism of evolution that would explain why organisms were so well suited for their particular natural environments. A lot of people erroneously think Darwin discovered evolution or invented that idea, and he didn't. It was around before Darwin. But he was really the first to kind of provide this detailed, in fact, very detailed explanation for how the environment is choosing who's going to survive, um, and hence shaping these populations. And he really started, when he finally published this, he started with a very clear argument on what he termed artificial selection, which we would really just call selective breeding of plants and animals. And this was something people were very familiar with, right? Humans have been selectively breeding plants and animals for thousands of years. And people were very well accepting of this idea that yes, we can shape these organisms by choosing who's going to breed with who. And in his theory of what he called natural selection, the idea was in the wild, the natural environment, just due to the fact that it is a difficult place to survive, right? There are, predators that may want to eat you. You have to be able to find food. You have to be able to find shelter, find a mate, avoid disease, etc. Because the natural environment is a difficult place to survive in, it is basically selecting, who's going to pass on their genes and shaping these natural populations over time. So, according to this idea of natural selection, assuming you have some genetically diverse population, it's only going to be those individuals in the population that are very best suited to survive in that particular environment. Those that have the traits, the adaptations that are going to allow them to survive and pass on their genes. Those are the ones that are going to influence the genetics of that population. And his very famous book is called On the Origin of Species, which was published in 1859. And this is alluding to the fact that he realized and proposed in this writing that over very long periods of time, these, gradual changes in populations could actually result in the production of new species. And we'll talk about this method of speciation. So how do new species form? What does that even mean to say this is a specific species? We'll come back to that in a coming chapter. Now, famously, this idea was, and in some cases still is, controversial, because it implied, really for the first time, that life on Earth was constantly changing, whereas the church's position at that time was, no, everything is as God created it, and nothing will really change over time at all. So he was actually, because of his background in theology and his desire to, work in the church, he was very hesitant to publish his theory because he knew it was going to upset the church at that time. Um, but eventually, he was kind of pushed into having to get it out there. And I'm happy to talk with you about this outside of class, but I don't think there's really any reason that religion and this, as I said, simple idea of evolution need to be in conflict with each other. I think there's certainly room for both. All right, so coming back to Darwin's theory of natural selection, there was really three main components. So one, as I already mentioned, is that species can change over time, right, due to genetic changes in a population driven by mutation, driven by just sexual reproduction. Um, the second kind of main idea is that this idea of common ancestry. So if you look at two, let's say, closely related species, similar species, Darwin would say they are similar because they shared some common ancestor in the past. And then, as I already mentioned, Darwin was proposing the mechanism by which this change was taking place, and that was natural selection. So again, I'll link to another video that I think very clearly describes this idea of natural selection in case I've lost you with my description. But again, it's just that basic idea that because the natural world is a difficult place to survive, it is selecting for those traits that are going to allow survival and propagation. Now, it's also important to point out here that evolution is a phenomenon that only affects populations, so individuals do not evolve. Of course, individuals are part of populations and are part of this process, but it is a population-based phenomenon. And if you're not familiar with that term, a population is just a group of individuals of the same species that are all living together in the same area, interbreeding with each other. Um, and as we've said, right, those members in any population, those individuals that are most fit, biologically fit, meaning most able to survive and reproduce, are going to be those that are going to pass on their genes, their traits to future generations. And so, really, for this whole process of population-based evolution to occur, you have to have some genetic diversity. So imagine you have a population where all the individuals are clones of each other, genetically identical. Um, you know, they may be doing just fine under the current environmental conditions, but of course, one of the tenets of evolution is that environments change over time. So if you have this population where everybody is identical, and let's say the environment changes in some way, now the entire population is either going to respond favorably and it'll survive or not. And if not, if they're not able to adapt to this change, then the population may completely go extinct. So this is one of the reasons biologists are always talking about the importance of diversity, because it's going to allow for the survival of populations, the evolution of populations over time. And a lack of diversity is going to put a population at much higher risk of extinction. So, as I mentioned, the bulk of this chapter is going to focus on some of these known mechanisms that help drive evolutionary change. And, we've already touched on this idea of natural selection, but we'll come back to it again. And I wanted to just briefly kind of go through some of the other key forces driving evolution, and those are mutation, gene flow, what's called genetic drift, non-random mating, and, as I said, natural selection. So let's start with mutation. I realize we've already talked about mutation in a previous chapter, But just remember, mutation is any change in the nucleotide sequence of a DNA molecule. So any change to the bases, nitrogenous bases. And mutations tend to be random, and as we've discussed before, most mutations are either going to be neutral, meaning they have no effect on the individual, or they're going to be harmful and cause disease or be deleterious in some way. But very rarely you will get a mutation that causes some new phenotype that's actually beneficial. Um, or it's possible you have some mutation that's neutral under the current environmental conditions, but all of a sudden the environment changes, and now that that trait due to mutation could suddenly become an advantage. Um, Also want to point out mutation rates are generally very, very slow, right? Our genomes have been designed to prevent mutation, try to repair mutation because it is often harmful. So, because mutation rates are very low, this is sort of like a very slow, steady driver of evolution. Think of it as happening at a very slow background rate. Second on the list, second mechanism is what's called gene flow, and this is referring to genes flowing between populations. So, how would that happen? Well, of course, genes can only flow between populations if individuals are moving from one population to another and taking their genes with them. And this can be advantageous or deleterious to a population just depending on which genes are flowing, right? So, if you have an individual moving into a population and they're bringing some new advantageous trait, advantageous mutation with them, that's going to be good probably for the long-term fitness and survival of that population. But if an individual is bringing in some deleterious, harmful mutation and trait, that's obviously not going to be a good thing. So gene flow is constantly happening, and whether or not it's helping or hurting a population is just going to depend on the particular individuals and the particular genes that are moving between populations. Next is what's called genetic drift. And genetic drift results from just random changes in the frequencies of specific versions of genes, specific alleles in a population. And generally, genetic drift is going to be a harmful phenomenon. It's usually going to reduce genetic diversity and typically be bad for a population. But it does happen with some regularity, and this is why we're talking about it here as one of these key factors that can influence evolution and survival. And there's really two main examples I wanted to point out of genetic drift. There's what's called the bottleneck effect and the founder effect. And they're both pretty simple ideas. The bottleneck effect would be when there's some dramatic reduction in the size of a population due to, let's say, disease, some natural disaster, flood, for example. And the whole idea is those individuals that survive this disaster are likely going to have less overall genetic diversity than the original population had, right? So here's our bottle. Imagine these beans represent the original diverse population. We have our bottleneck event, right? Whatever it happens to be, let's say disease, and only a few individuals survive that event. And even if, that small surviving population regrows into a large population over time, the surviving population is probably going to lose some diversity, right? We see in this case, there's a lot more red beans than yellow beans here, whereas our original population was much more 50-50 split red yellow, so we've lost some diversity. And again, if you lose diversity, that's going to make that population less adaptable to change and more susceptible to extinction in the long run. And the founder effect happens when you have a small handful of individuals getting separated from a large diverse population, and then starting a new population. So, maybe they're, you know, separated intentionally or due to some accident, some storm, right? In this case, our single ladybug, let's say this is a pregnant female, gets blown away from the original population and finds itself on some island, lays its eggs, and it's now establishing this new population. And just as we saw with the bottleneck effect, this new population may grow to a large size, but it's not going to contain the same diversity that we had in our original population, and that is probably going to be uh, harmful to the long-term survival. So I will stop there and I will pick up on the last couple of key mechanisms in the second part.